Hello and welcome to Docual. My name is Riley, and as you might see by the title, this is going to be a two-part series. That is because we will be looking at different killers who were active during the early 70s in the Santa Cruz area of California. They were not connected, nor did they know each other, making the search for them much more difficult. These two murderers were Edmund Kemper and Herbert Mullen. As always, if you enjoy this content, please consider liking and subscribing for more like it. And with that, join me as I delve into one of the inspirations for both Buffalo Bill and Patrick Bateman, Ed Kemper. Please be aware this episode will contain violent and graphic descriptions of murder and sexual assault. Please view at your own discretion. Clarnell Elizabeth Kemper and Edmund Emil Kemper Jr. were married on the 26th of January, 1942. Edmund Jr. was a World War II veteran who had enlisted on June 21, 1939. In 1943, they welcomed a little girl, Susan Huey. By 1945, Edmund Jr. was discharged from the Army and was working as a nuclear weapons tester. On December 18, 1948, they welcomed another child, this time a boy, Edmund Emil Kemper III. For ease in this video, he will always be referred to as just Kemper. He weighed a whopping 13 pounds at birth and was predicted to be a large child. His father, now working as an electrician, was often away from home, leaving his mother in charge of the household. 3 years after his birth, the family added another daughter, Aileen Lee. By 4 years old, the prediction that he would grow to be quite large was becoming true. He was a full head taller than all of his peers. The picture of the perfect American family crumbled as you looked closer. Clarnell was dissatisfied with her husband's menial job as an electrician, and the two often fought. Edmund Jr. later stated that suicide missions in wartime and atomic bomb testings were nothing compared to living with Clarnell, and that she affected him as a grown man more than 396 days of fighting on the front did. As a child, Kemper showed disturbing signs of antisocial behavior, often having dark fantasies as well. He frequently tortured insects and other animals, and instead of playing the usual childhood games, Kemper instead elected to play electric chair and gas chamber, instructing Aileen to tie him up and flip a switch. He would writhe on the floor pretending to be electrocuted or gassed to death. In addition to playing unusual games, Kemper would perform rituals with Aileen's dolls. He would cut off their heads and hands and supposedly perform bizarre sexual practices with them. Recalling a few instances from his past, Kemper remembered his sister Susan asking him why he did not kiss his teacher. In fact, she teased him about it. He responded, "If I kiss her, I would have to kill her first." Two other memories also included Susan. One was when she attempted to push him in front of a train, and the second was when she pushed him into the deep end of a swimming pool, causing him to almost drown. At age 9, his parents divorced, and he and his sisters moved with their mom to Helena, Montana. Kemper resented the move and longed to be back with his father. As time went on, the relationship between mother and son became increasingly worse. Clarnell began drinking heavily and was becoming increasingly neurotic. A year after moving to Montana, Kemper would bury the family cat alive. Once it had died, he dug it back up, decapitating it like he had done to Aileen's dolls, and placed its head on a spike. He was successfully able to lie about the event to his mother, giving him great pleasure in avoiding punishment. 3 years later, he would kill another family cat, this time stabbing it to death. He believed it favored his younger sister, and therefore it needed to die. He dismembered the cat and kept the pieces in his closet, which would later be discovered by his mother. However, it is unknown what repercussions came from this. As time went on, Clarnell frequently abused Kemper. She would belittle him and humiliate him for his size. As a teen, he stood at 6'4", and she refused to show him any affection for fear that it would turn him gay. She would also force him to sleep in a locked basement, fearing what he would do to his sisters after his previous behaviors. And in one instance, Kemper overheard her talking to his father on the phone, calling him a real weirdo. At 14, Kemper decided to run away from his mother's and try and reconnect with his father. He successfully made the trip from Montana to his father's home in California. But upon arriving, he found out that his father had married a German immigrant, Alfred Weber, and her son Gilbert, who was 2 years older than Kemper, were living in the house. Kemper resented Gilbert, feeling as though he had replaced him in his father's eyes. This, along with his father noticing a personality change in Kemper and his new wife's increasing migraines after Kemper's arrival, pushed Edmund Jr. to send Kemper to live with his grandparents. Kemper's grandparents, Edmund Emil Kemper Sr. and Maud Matilda Kemper, had been married for 50 years and lived on a ranch in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. Kemper later stated that he hated living there for many reasons, one of which was the emasculation he perceived his grandmother directed towards him and his grandfather. This was particularly upsetting to Kemper, as many regarded Kemper's grandfather as the only person the boy ever loved. He idolized him, saw him as an original cowboy and a tough guy wrangler. The only joy he found there was when his grandfather bought a .22 and showed him how to shoot it. He would regularly hunt small game and shoot birds around the property. However, his grandmother hated this. So much so, she convinced Edmund Sr. to take the gun away. Kemper later remembered that this infuriated him, as he saw shooting as the only outlet for his growing aggression. It would be this gun that changed everything. On August 27, 1964, Kemper and Maud were sat in the kitchen at the table having an argument while Maud worked on a children's book she was writing. Kemper stormed off in the middle of the argument enraged. Unbeknownst to Maud, he had gone to retrieve the rifle. Re-entering the kitchen, Maud saw the rifle in his hands, saying, "Oh, you better not be shooting the birds again." These would be her last words, as Kemper proceeded to shoot her in the head and twice in the back. He then wrapped her head in a towel, dragging her into a bedroom. He returned to the kitchen to grab a knife and proceeded to stab Maud 3 times, so hard the knife bent double. He would later state, "I didn't think she was dead, and I didn't want her to suffer any longer." Edmund Sr., who had been out buying groceries, then pulled into the driveway. Kemper retrieved the rifle he had just murdered Maud with and went out to greet his grandfather. To save his grandfather the gruesome discovery of finding his wife of 50 years shot dead, Kemper shot him to death standing in the driveway. Making his way back inside the home, Kemper recalls that he thought to undress his grandmother and explore her body sexually to satisfy his carnal curiosity. However, he shook this from his mind as being too perverted, and instead called his mother to explain what he had done. Upon hearing her son's story, Clarnell instructed him to phone the police, which he did. He was arrested and questioned as to why he killed his grandparents, with his reply being, "I just wanted to see what it felt like to kill Grandma." Facing the courts at 15, it was determined that his crimes were inconceivable for someone so young to commit, without there being something seriously wrong. And so he was sent for imprisonment and evaluation at the Escudero State Hospital, a high-security mental health facility in California. It was here that Kemper would be diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. When Kemper was at the state hospital, psychiatrists and social workers began to question the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, as he showed no flight of ideas, no interference with thought, no expressions with delusions or hallucinations, and no evidence of bizarre thinking, all criteria that were needed for this diagnosis. They regarded him as a model prisoner and a good worker, as they trained him to administer psychiatric tests to fellow inmates. Recalling Kemper's stay, one psychiatrist highlighted that Kemper's behavior was nowhere typical for someone with a schizophrenic or sociopathic diagnosis. While there, Kemper scored highly on his IQ tests, receiving a 145. He was also diagnosed with a personality trait disturbance and was a passive-aggressive type. However, it is important to note that all of these diagnoses and evaluations were conducted in a non-natural environment and are mainly based on personal recollection from Kemper, and therefore should be looked at with a careful eye. As mentioned before, while at the hospital, Kemper had a job administering psychiatric tests to fellow inmates. It was through these tests that Kemper later stated he was able to better understand what the psychiatrists were looking for, and it would allow him to manipulate the psychiatrists when he was being questioned. As many of the inmates he was questioning were in fact sex offenders, Kemper has said he learned much from them and gained much of his sexual awareness from their stories. He said that his sexual fantasies were increasingly violent and more in line with the stories the rapist he interviewed told. However, this was one of the many things he kept to himself when talking with psychiatrists. When talking about his time at the hospital, he stated, "One thing I learned at Ascadaro was you don't get far if you regret anything." On Kemper's 21st birthday, he was released on parole, and against the recommendation of the hospital psychiatrists, he was released into his mother's care. Once released, he learned that his mother had been married and divorced since his incarceration and had moved to Aptos, California, where she was now working at the University of California in Santa Cruz as an admin assistant. A condition of his parole was that he had to attend community college, and he happily went with the end goal of becoming a police officer. With this goal in mind, he worked hard, and 3 years following his release, he was deemed rehabilitated, and his juvenile records were permanently expunged. Kemper eventually applied to join the police force, however he was rejected due to his height. At this point, he had grown to be 6'9" and surpassed the maximum height limit to join the force. However, he maintained a relationship with the local police officers in the Santa Cruz area, frequently joining them at the local cop bar, the Jury Room. Following his rejection, he gained employment with the California Division of Highways, and it was in working this job that he was able to save enough money to move to Alameda with a friend after hostilities in living with his mother continued to increase. It was also around this time that he met a student from Turnlock High School, and they were engaged in 1973. However, her name has never been released, and following events to come, their engagement was broken off. All that is known about her was that she was young, small, blonde, and immature, and they never engaged in a sexual relationship as Kemper worshipped her almost religiously. During this time, Kemper was also in a motorcycle accident in which a car hit him. In a civil suit against the car's operator, he won $15,000, approximately $91,000 today. And with some of this money, he purchased a 1969 Ford Galaxy. It was in this car that he began picking up a large number of women who were hitchhiking. He estimated the number was around 150. He also began to start storing knives, plastic bags, blankets, and handcuffs in his car. As he said, the homicidal sexual urges became stronger. It would be soon after this that he would begin to give in to those urges. Before we continue, I want to take a moment to say the following themes may be distressing, and I have done my best to respect the memories of those who I will be talking about. Mary Ann Pesce was born on the 19th of July, 1953, in New York to parents Gabriel and Lois. She had 4 siblings, Vincent, Mark, Lori, and Barbara. Anita Lucchesa was born on the 29th of October, 1953, to parents Alvin and Natividad in Modesto, California. By the 7th of May, 1972, Mary and Anita were 18 years old, and they were close friends, attending school at Fresno State University. On that day, they were in Berkeley, attempting to hitchhike to Stanford University, approximately 40 miles away. It was here that they were picked up by Kemper. Although they were wanting to go to Stanford University, Kemper used his knowledge from work to divert their route to a more secluded wooded area, an hour away from where they started. It was here that Kemper handcuffed Mary and locked Anita in the trunk of his car. While handcuffing Mary, he later recalled that his hand brushed up against her breast, embarrassing him and causing him to say, "Whoops, I'm sorry." It was immediately after this that he stabbed and strangled Mary to death. He retrieved Anita from his trunk and did the same to her that he had done to Mary. Afterwards, he placed both girls in his trunk and headed back to his apartment. While driving, he was stopped by police for a broken taillight, but the officer, not sensing anything out of the ordinary, sent him on his way. When Kemper arrived home, his roommate was absent, and so he took the bodies inside, at which time he sexually assaulted them and took pictures before dismembering them. He proceeded to bag both their bodies up and abandon them near Loma Prieta mountain. However, before disposing of their heads in a ravine, he sexually assaulted them again. In August of 1972, Mary's skull was found near the ravine where Kemper had disposed of it. In a later interview with Kemper, he was asked why he decapitated his victims. He replied, "The head trip fantasies were a bit like a trophy. You know, the head is where everything is at. The brain, the eyes, mouth, that's the person. I remember being told as a kid, you cut off the head and the body dies. The body is nothing after the head is cut off. Well, that's not quite true. There's a lot left in a girl's body without the head." Ayuku Ku was born in San Francisco, California, to mother Skidrai. Her father was Korean but had left before she was born. On September 14th, 1972, Ayuku was waiting for the bus to her dance class, but she had missed the first bus that usually got her in on time for class, and so she decided to try and hitchhike. Kemper was the one to pick up the young hitchhiker. Once again, Kemper was able to divert his path to a more remote area. Once there, he pulled out a gun, and in order to subside Ayuku's fear, he told her he only had the gun as he was planning on killing himself, and if she listened and didn't try to flag anyone down, no harm would come to her. When he left the car, he accidentally left the gun behind and locked himself out of the car. However, believing his story and not sensing the immediate danger she was in, Ayuku unlocked the door and allowed Kemper back in. Once Kemper was back in the car, he proceeded to choke Ayuku until she was unconscious, sexually assaulting her and then killing her by strangling her with her own scarf. As he had done previously, he put Ayuku in the trunk of his car. However, this time, instead of going straight home, he decided to stop at a bar and have a few drinks before heading home. He would later say that upon leaving the bar, he opened the trunk of his car, admiring his catch like a fisherman. Back at his house, he brought Ayuku's body into his apartment. He sexually assaulted her corpse and then disposed of her body in the same manner he did his previous two victims. Following Ayuku's disappearance, her mother called the police to report her missing, and would go on to put hundreds of flyers pleading for information about her daughter's disappearance. All of these would go unanswered. Cynthia Ann Shaw was born on August 4th, 1954, in San Mateo County, California, to parents William and Suzanne Shaw. She was better known to friends and family as Cindy. She was studying at Cabrillo College to become either a teacher or a police officer. On January 7th, 1973, 18-year-old Cindy was looking for a ride at the Cabrillo College campus and was picked up by Kemper. Once again, Kemper proceeded to drive to a secluded wooded area. This time, instead of using the gun as a scare tactic as he had done with Ayuku, he used it to kill Cindy, shooting her in the head. As with his previous victims, he once again put her in the trunk of his car. He proceeded to drive back to his mother's house, where he was once again living. Out of his mother's view, he was able to bring Cindy's body into the house and place her in a closet in his bedroom. The following morning, once his mother had left for work, he sexually assaulted Cindy's corpse and proceeded to dismember her body in his mother's bathtub, retrieving the bullet from her skull before he disposed of her remains by throwing them off a cliff, keeping her head, which he kept and repeatedly sexually assaulted. A few days following her murder, Kemper took her head and buried it in his mother's garden, facing his mother's bedroom. He would later say he did this as his mother always wanted people to look up to her. In the weeks following her death, all Cindy's remains were discovered, apart from her head, which would not be found until much later. A pathologist had determined that she had been dismembered with a power saw. Rosalind Thorpe was born on the 30th of September, 1949 in Los Angeles County, California, to parents Roland and Marjorie. She was studying both linguistics and psychology at the University of California. Allison Lee was born on the 8th of February 1952 in Los Angeles County, California. She was also studying at the University of California and had initially majored in teaching, but had recently switched to Oriental Studies. On February 5th, 1973, Kemper had left his house after a heated argument with his mother and drove to the Santa Cruz campus of the University of California. Recently, the university had put out a statement to students regarding the recent disappearances of hitchhikers. They had advised all students to only accept rides from cars that displayed the university sticker. Unfortunately, unknown to the university, one man they were afraid of was able to get that sticker, as his mother worked for the university. This man was Kemper. Rosalind was the first to accept a ride from Kemper, talking with him for a little while until they came across Alice. Neither girl was afraid to enter the car due to him having the official sticker displayed, and for Alice the decision was less daunting, as Rosalind was already in the car. While driving, Kemper pointed out views and proceeded to slow down. It was at this moment that he shot Rosalind in the head. He then turned the gun to Alice, firing at her in the back seat several times. However, neither shot killed her. He continued to drive until he reached a cul-de-sac, where he shot Alice in the head and moved both bodies into his trunk. On his way home, Kemper was in no rush, even stopping to get gas at the station before returning to his mother's house. Upon arriving home, he decided he needed cigarettes, and so he headed out again. While out, he decided to open his trunk and behead both bodies. As his mother was home, he left the bodies in his trunk overnight, and in the morning he collected Alice's body and Rosalind's head and brought them back into the house. At this time, he sexually assaulted Alice's body and removed all bullets from both. He then proceeded to dispose of both girls in the same way he had his previous victims. On April 20th, 1973, Clarnell Kemper came home from a party. Her arrival woke Kemper up. She proceeded to go upstairs to her bedroom and was reading a book when Kemper entered her room and sat on her bed. Clarnell said to him, "I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now." To which he replied, "No, good night." He left her room and waited for her to fall asleep. Once he knew she was asleep, he snuck back into her room and bludgeoned her to death with a claw hammer. He then slit her throat with a penknife. Kemper proceeded to decapitate his mother, sexually assaulting her head and using it as a dartboard while screaming at it. After he was finished playing darts, he removed her tongue and larynx, attempting to put both of them down the garbage disposal. However, it could not break down the vocal cords and ejected them back into the sink. Kemper would later recount that this seemed appropriate, as much as she'd bitched and screamed and yelled at me over the many years. He proceeded to put his mother's corpse in a closet and head out for a drink. Upon his return home, he invited his mother's friend, Sally Hallett, over to have dinner and watch a movie. When Sally arrived, he strangled her to death in order to attempt to create a cover story that Clarnell and Sally had gone away together on vacation. He proceeded to put Sally in the closet with his mother, and quickly thereafter he abandoned his initial idea and would flee his home, leaving a note for the police. It read, "Not sloppy and incomplete, gents, just a lack of time. I got things to do. Approximately 5:15 a.m. Saturday. No need for her to suffer any more at the hands of this horrible, murderous butcher. It was quick, asleep, the way I wanted it." Following the murder of his mother and her friend, Kemper drove non-stop to Pueblo, Colorado, nearly 1,000 miles away. He took caffeine pills to stay awake during the drive, and did all of this as he believed the bodies would have been discovered and a massive manhunt would be searching for him. In the car, he had 3 guns and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. While he drove, he continued to listen to the radio to see if there were any reports concerning the discovery of his mother's murder. Not hearing anything, he decided to call the police, just as his mother had advised back when he murdered his grandparents. Once connected, he explained to the call handler what he had done. However, they did not take him seriously and told him to ring back at a later time. Following these instructions, Kemper waited a few hours and then rang again, asking to speak to an officer he personally knew. Once again, he confessed to killing his mother and her friend and said that he would await capture. The police, finally taking these confessions seriously, arrived to arrest him. At this time, Kemper immediately confessed to all of his crimes. When asked later in an interview why he turned himself in, Kemper stated, "The original purpose was gone. It wasn't serving any physical or real or emotional purpose. It was just a pure waste of time. Emotionally, I couldn't handle it much longer. Toward the end there, I started feeling the folly of the whole damn thing, and at the point of near exhaustion, near collapse, I just said to hell with it and called it off. On May 7th, 1973, Kemper was indicted on 8 counts of murder in the first degree, and was assigned the Chief Public Defender of Santa Cruz County, Jim Jackson, to head his defense. As Kemper had already provided a graphic confession to the murders, Jackson's only defense was to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. While in custody awaiting trial, Kemper attempted suicide twice, both times being unsuccessful, and on the 10th of October, 1973, his trial began. The court's first order of business was to establish the extent of Kemper's sanity. 3 court-appointed psychiatrists investigated both him and his juvenile records. One psychiatrist, Dr. Joel Fort, interviewed Kemper using truth serum. Truth serum is a colloquial name for any range of psychoactive drugs. The idea at the time was to enhance the subject's truth-telling. However, the use of them has since been banned due to their suggestibility and their potential of violation of human rights. Some have gone so far as to call it torture. Essentially, someone under the influence of a truth serum can be, in theory, persuaded to say absolutely anything the interviewer asks them to by mere suggestion. Fort would carry out his interview and would tell the courts that Kemper had confessed to cannibalizing his victims. However, this was later recanted by Kemper himself, which could possibly be put down to the psychoactive drugs used in the truth serum. All 3 court-appointed psychiatrists found Kemper to be legally sane. In regard to California law, legally sane refers to the Manhattan Standard, which holds that at the time of committing the act, the accused must not be of sound mind or aware that their actions were wrong. To this standard, Kemper was found sane, and it was determined he understood not only what he was doing, but that it was also wrong. On November 11th, 1973, Kemper took the stand in an attempt to convince the jury that he was, in fact, insane, as only someone who was insane could have committed these crimes. He said that 2 beings inhabited his body, his personality and his killer personality. He said that when his killer personality took over, it was kind of like blacking out. Kemper would tell his attorney the real reason he disposed of the girls' bodies was because they were rotting and I was losing them. He explained, when the girls died, I kept them a certain length of time, but I couldn't keep them any longer. However, he declared, I still have their spirits. On November 8th, 1973, the 6-man, 6-woman jury left for deliberation. 5 hours later, they found him sane and guilty on all counts. In his sentencing, he asked for the death penalty, requesting death by torture. However, at this time in California, there was a hold put on capital punishment, and instead he would receive 7 years to life for each count served concurrently in the California Medical Facility, Vacaville, a male-only state medical facility. Kemper was eligible for parole 7 years following his trial. However, up to now, he has attempted 9 times to gain parole and been rejected every time. He is next eligible in 2024. However, it is most likely that he will never be granted parole, as to quote a prosecutor in 2007, "We don't care how much of a model prisoner he is, because of the enormity of his crimes." During his time in prison so far, he has shared the same prison block as other notorious criminals, including Charles Manson and Herbert Mullen, the latter of which will be the subject of Part 2. Kemper remains in Gen Pop and is widely regarded as a model prisoner. He has been in charge of scheduling appointments for prisoners with their psychiatrists, and strangely has recorded audiobooks, one of which being Star Wars. In 2015, he retired from all prison positions after experiencing a stroke which left him medically disabled. While in prison, he has given numerous interviews and has worked alongside the FBI to save others from killing. In an interview on Murder, No Apparent Motive, he said, "There's someone out there that is watching this and hasn't done that, hasn't killed people and wants to, and rages inside and struggles with that feeling, or is so sure they have it under control. They need to talk to someone about it. Trust someone enough to sit down and talk about something that isn't a crime. Thinking that way isn't a crime. Doing it isn't just a crime. It's a horrible thing. It doesn't know when to quit, and it can't be stopped easily once it starts. When asked by former Administrator Edward George of the California Medical Facility what his greatest achievement was, Kemper replied, "I taught women not to hitchhike." Thank you everyone for joining me for part 1 of our series. Next week, join us when we discuss the crimes of Herbert Mullen. Until then, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more content like this.